on Lifetime.
You've been fired from your job, and God knows where you were last night. You guys and your God.
When all is lost,
Don't run just for the sake of running, because you may just be running for the rest of your life.
only faith remains.
I had to lose everything and finally find God.
Starring Paula Patton,
I am so scared.
Loretta Devine, Stephen Bishop, and Keith David.
I can't give up.
Don't miss Finding Faith. Premieres tomorrow at 8 on Lifetime.
Are you ready to get spicy?
These Doritos Golden Sriracha aren't that spicy.
Maybe it's time to turn up the heat.
Or turn it down. It's time for something that's not too spicy. Try Doritos Golden Sriracha.
Spicy.
But not too spicy.
You've landed at Spark Launch, the guide star for embracing what it means to be neurodiverse. I'm Mike Cornell, joined by CEO of Spark Launch, Chaya Malavarma. Here, we navigate mental health triumphs and tribulations from all across the spectrum, charting a course to the shared experiences that unite us, and discovering how to embody the unique strengths within neurodivergent and neurotypical alike, igniting your spark and launching it into a better tomorrow. Hello there, I'm Mike.
I'm Chaya.
And today we want to welcome onto the show Jane Singleton, the founder of Launchpad for Life, and with 13 years of experience as a learning specialist and educational leader, and of course is an ICF certified executive coach. She helps clients build awareness around their cognitive and emotional profiles to create sustainable habit change that can help them leverage their strengths to reach their career and life goals. She has developed customized training for organizations on topics such as executive functioning, effective communication, growing and maintaining self-esteem and motivation, along with cognitive efficiency. Welcome to the show, Jane.
Thanks for having me. Welcome, Jane. When I meet an entrepreneur, I love to understand where their deep passion is coming, because there's always an energy from inside that is bursting to happen. And so what is your story?
So my story, I think I'll try to make a long story short in some ways. I think my first inspiration for working with people with disabilities honestly started in high school. I used to work as a camp counselor for a camp that was specific for people with disabilities, mostly physical disabilities. And I was, I did it for a couple summers. I was like 17 and I got to know the campers really well. Some of them were really close in my age. And one of them brought up, like, why are we doing this like child's play stuff at camp? Like, I like Britney Spears too. I was just like, this girl will forever be in my mind. I like Britney Spears too. And I was like, you're right. I was like, so we kind of created this campaign to play Britney Spears instead of some of the other stuff that was going on at camp. But to me, it was like that teenage moment where you're like, maybe the adults aren't always getting it right, if that makes sense. And it really stuck with me that I felt like people with disabilities weren't being listened to. And I think from there, like, became an ally, studied psychology and did a lot of research in my capstone for an after-school program for kids with ADHD. Later went on to get my master's in special ed. And then through building programs for the past 13 years in independent schools where it's not quite as bureaucratic and there's a gray area to help kids, and I was creating protocols, I found over time that we weren't always addressing the issues that they needed to, the skills they really needed to be successful in life, like college and career where there's more independence. And the idea for my business, ironically, came from a colleague who said, Jane, you really know your stuff. Like, out of the blue, she comes up to me and she was like, have you ever thought about working with adults? Like, I have a stepdaughter and this is the scenario, and there's no help out there. And I was like, I haven't, but I was like, I think I could be really into this. And that was my first client. And honestly, from there, I was like, this is way better than helping a student pass a math test. Like, this is so much more important. There's these huge gaps. And I realized, even with the best intentions and the best school systems, I feel like how we deal with like facilitating and supporting kids that have learning disabilities, their self-esteem gets chipped at over time. And then they start to self-doubt to an extent where they just always assume in the workplace that their manager's right. And so I got to coach. I was like, well, actually, I've had a lot of bad bosses. I was like, not everybody knows what they're doing. And my client had shared with me that she told a coworker that she had dyslexia. And someone was like, can't you just take a pill for that? And I was like, wow, we really don't have a shared baseline knowledge of what learning disabilities are, and how impossible does that make that to be like appropriately supported in the workplace? And so from there, I was like, it's not enough to do bottom up, right? Working with individuals with neurodivergent needs. I was like, we have to start educating organizations. So I was like, I'm going to get my leadership certification. What does every manager need to know about the brain? Because there's a larger piece there, whether you're formally diagnosed or not. Why wouldn't organizations like want to know more about, hey, you can notice these patterns in the people that you supervise, and then you should think about that in how you leverage teams, for example. Or please stop asking Dan to do the scheduling if he has horrible attention to detail. Like, why are you setting him up for failure? And I think the larger piece over time, both in education and in working in organizations and with leaders, is they don't know. And when we don't know, neurotypical people like shut down and they don't ask questions. They're just like embarrassed. They're like, this person doesn't know how to do this thing. And I feel so awkward about being direct about it. And so the miscommunication begins and rolls on. So I love effective communication. I do think it's a talent of mine. I really love sharing that because I think if we had less miscommunication, like ultimately everybody would be in a better place.
From your story, I can tell you have incredible amount of empathy, even as a child, even as a teenager. And I wonder if you do consider yourself as neurodivergent. Also, I'd love for you to share the gaps that you see in schooling today, because my son went to a private school. I paid a lot of money for that, but my husband and I, but it still didn't satisfy. Right. And I didn't even know why I was sending it. My subconsciously, it was because of my challenges, but I had overcome a lot of my challenges through my career, doing what I love and what I'm passionate about. But I knew schooling was incredibly important. So our focus was to send him to some of the best schools, but he still experienced a lot of challenges. In fact, I wonder if he would have been better off in a public school. You always wonder, right? So, and I've spoken to other parents who have ADHD children who feel the same. They felt it was a waste of money after going through that journey. So what do you have to share?
Oh, I have so many thoughts on this. I think school placement is so tricky. I think if we put a kid in an environment where they're constantly feeling less than and they don't have people that they can identify with, we all struggle at something. I think that is so true. I think we're actually creating an environment where they tend to not be willing to like embrace their weaknesses, which we all have. We have strengths and weaknesses. But if I'm in an environment where I don't feel comfortable, I'm not going to advocate. I'm not going to ask for help. And therefore, I'm losing out on a lot of learning. And then I'm also losing out probably on showing up authentically and making good social connections, or even feeling comfortable in my own skin. And so, as you can imagine, those skill sets of self-advocacy, asking for help, going to office hours in college or talking to your boss about what you need, all of those are essential. And I think sometimes too, as parents, I do a lot of parent coaching. I do a lot of speaking engagements with parents. And I think as a mentor, I don't care if you're a parent, a teacher, somebody who just wants to be an ally for people who are neurodivergent, you really have to sit with yourself and think, what are my own biases with learning disabilities? There's a long, dare I say, dark history with special education and learning support. I've worked with, I was kind of the gatekeeper of whether we should move forward with an evaluation. And I was like the face of recommending that. And sometimes parents, they were in special education and they had a horrible experience and they're scarred from it. And then they were like, I'm going to shove this away. I don't want my kid to identify with this at all. And that has the opposite effect. If we can't embrace like what we need, we are stigmatizing that. And I think with the best of intentions, mentors, whatever role that is in that child's life, that's playing out. And you know what? That impacts self-awareness. I worked really long and hard I always had the child be part of their learning support plan. We should not be hiding the details of a cognitive profile. I also think a huge mistake is both parents and mentors, as well as the kids, get overly obsessed with a label. it's really not the label. It's those cognitive characteristics, right? What's your working, memory, processing speed. And I won't get too technical with my jargon because, I live in that world, but I don't think it's as much of the label as like really understanding how your brain works so you can lean into your strengths, but also understand, why do I need accommodation? Why do I need help in this particular area? Or why do I need to use a strategy, for example, to support my working memory or processing speed? Because you might agree with this. There is no buy-in if I don't understand the why, especially with neurodivergent individuals. Like, the why could not be more important to motivation. So we're like, so many people are like tiptoeing around and wanting to make it this like perfect complement sandwich when we talk about the brain. And we need to be direct and say, hey, this is like how this works. This is how you can grow it. Or in some cases, it's not that everything like grows perfectly and you can like fix it. I hate that idea of like fixing. I do believe in neuroplasticity, of course. And you have to learn how to work with your weaknesses just as much you have to learn to leverage your strengths.
I love the fact that, you work with children and work on showing their strengths, right? But label is, as you said, we don't want to get married to it, but it's giving us clues, right? It's giving us clues about our brain. And so it is critical that we embrace it because it's telling us a lot of information. And that's why parents should not look at it as a negative, because there's a wealth of information and we are not in any competition mode, right? We are on our own life journey. And I think really important that we get that diagnosis and then learn to work with it.
100%.
And even the less than is because the school systems are built for neurotypical individuals, right? And I always wonder, if you put the neurotypicals in a school which is built for neurodivergent, they will also feel the lack, right? They're not there. If you're constantly asking for thinking outside the box, and if someone is a rule follower, and they're going to feel uncomfortable. So it's not about, one is greater than the other. We all have something unique to offer, and just let's figure what that is.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. And I do want to clarify, I'm not anti-diagnosis. I think the diagnosis is important. I just think more time needs to be spent with the details, because what I see trending is these really broad strokes of like ADHD means this, autism means this, ADHD means this. And the truth is, every single I've read thousands, right? Like, I've spent a lot of time in this work, and there's a lot of snowflake stuff, because if we start making these broad strokes, we're leaning into that comparison piece. And quite frankly, we know that there's twice exceptional people that have immense strengths, and that does help them overcome some of the hardships of a particular diagnosis. It just looks different. And so that's just where I want to find that balance for sure. And I think for sure socially, if we were to like build this ideal school that was geared towards maybe neurodivergent individuals, it would look really different. But when I think it comes to learning, I'm really big on universal design for learning. I think a lot of the scaffolds that we put in place for neurodivergent individuals is just accessible for everybody. I have to say that. Like, I really, truly believe if we were following like the clear standards for universal design for learning, and the training of the teachers was like pretty much on point in the same way, and we mastered differentiation, which is like, I feel like just an overused word with like a misunderstanding on so many levels, that could be a whole show. But I do believe that the stuff that we do for learning, like, everyone can access it. It's the stigma societally, and sometimes in the teaching profession or with people that don't understand neurodivergency, it's like they think you're dumbing it down, and that's not the case. You're scaffolding to build deeper insights and inferential thinking and critical thinking, and it's kind of like the stepping stool. I'm a tall person. I have a lot of short friends. Like, they need the stepping stool to reach the top cabinet. And the belief is, how can we make the ladder accessible so that everyone can reach the top cabinet? And maybe not everybody needs the stairs, but we're not like cutting someone's education short by offering the stairs.
There's a strong societal stigma when it comes to neurodiversity equals infantile, equals, like you said, dumbing it down, because neurodiversity equals some sort of extreme learning disability. And I think that sort of infantization that's been done through certain organizations, and honestly through pop culture, I think misunderstanding what autism is and misunderstanding what ADHD is and all of that has led to this idea that if you are changing any form of education, the purpose of it is to dumb it down, to make it easier for people to get, and easier for some reason equals not as good. I think human nature has this way of thinking the only possible solution is always the hardest solution. Otherwise, it's not actually worth going for. I'm a believer in work smarter, not harder.
Totally.
In most
totally.
instances.
That's how I sell all my services to kids. Would you like to spend less time on homework?
Yeah. And I think we've seen that most traditional education doesn't really work all that well. And there's not a lack of disinterest in learning from neurodivergent children or adults for that matter. If anything, there's probably more, especially if you're able to make learning kind of a special interest, which is what I was kind of adept at whenever I was a kid. And I was ended up being like pulled out of school. But thankfully, I was a nerd who liked learning. So I just kind of kept self-teaching myself. But I like the idea of, it's a scaffolding, right? It's just building up a better system for everybody. So that way it's all kind of on the same level. And to that end, it feels much more comforting for those who benefit maybe the most from it, instead of feeling like, there's the short bus stigma, things like that still for some stupid reason perpetuates the zeitgeist. But letting everyone be on the same level, equitable education, instead of let's throw people into special neurodivergent classes, which can be very traumatizing, even if they're very positive experiences, just because they're made to feel different.
I could not agree more. And I really want to build from your idea of this idea of intellectual curiosity, because when I think about that gift of the why, wanting to know the why before I do it, not only are you going to find the gaps and holes in an organization's protocol to potentially make it more efficient, but when I think about being a lifelong learner, it's intellectual curiosity. And sometimes, right, traditional schooling, this is what we have to get to. These are the objectives. And it's why? I think every teacher would be a better teacher as much as we can connect things to the outside world, to people's potential college or career goals. That's really, really important. And I even think, right, neurotypical people are a victim of checking these boxes. Cool. This is what I have to do now. I have to get all A's and B's to get here. But there's a lot of neurotypical people that don't have intellectual curiosity, but they're able to kind of more robotically go through their motions, if you will. But they might be more challenged in the critical thinking piece, which I think is actually a strength in neurodivergent individuals, wanting to know the why. And for sure, man, I avoid broad strokes, but some people with ADHD, do you think it's depending how your brain is set up, is that ability to hold multiple ideas in your head? It might appear as if you're looking distracted from a certain thing, but it allows you to build programs, complex ideas, sort of see how everything fits together. And what I work on with adults is you have all these ideas. And then a lot of my clients that do have ADHD, it's organizing them so neurotypical people can follow it. Because oftentimes the brain is working so quickly. And I would say this is a pattern. You were asking about patterns earlier. What do I see? I see a lot of my clients that have ADHD. They have the context in their head, but they're not sharing it. And so that becomes ineffective communication. It is, right? You can't expect somebody to pick up on the details or the framework. It's just so clear to you. So you assume. But we work on assumptions, both. I work with leaders who are neurotypical. I don't specifically just work with neurodivergent individuals. Going back to how my skill set transfers, it's more understanding when are we making assumptions about what the other person knows. And that's essential for leadership and moving the needle.
You said it so well, having multiple thoughts, right? It's not about getting rid of multiple thoughts. That's our gift, right? It's about learning how to juggle those multiple thoughts and then kind of put them in order within that 30 seconds. Right now, right, as I'm talking, and just pick one thing out of the multiple thoughts and just trust to talk about that one thing. Because if I'm paying too much attention on those multiple thoughts, I'm wasting my time and I'm going to stutter and all of that, and which is fine. That is totally fine. But I'm thinking of the older me, why was I always I had challenges with communication because there was so much of stress put on the perfection of the delivery and nobody talked about how to juggle this multiple thoughts. And so I think that's a gift. As you said, it's an absolute gift, and learning is our growth, right? But it's not getting rid of those multiple thoughts.
No, it's how do you harness those and then streamline them and organize your thoughts. I think one thing in this work that I've really noticed is we are not talking about language. We talk about organization, right? Materials, time blindness, but I've seen a lot of patterns of organization of language. And that's a huge area that I work on with my clients because it's hard to manage up without good language organization. And going back to how, when you have I'll just say, if you have a it's not even just a neurotypical boss. If you have someone who doesn't understand neurodivergent characteristics and you're kind of whatever in the dark, you're not giving appropriate feedback. I'm able to give appropriate to my feedback to my clients, and then they can actually work on their communication. But you can't work on something when you're not aware of it. I'm just going to go back to that. And so if everybody's just like smiling and nodding at you, like it's a disservice. And so that's what I work a lot on with parents. I was like, being direct, if you're helping somebody grow, is like not a bad thing. It's a good thing.
Totally agree, especially about being direct, because what I experienced is in my son's middle school, nobody told us that he has ADHD, right? They were only dinging for him talking in class, and they used to give him a rubber band that he had to put it around his wrist and like hit himself with it, which is ridiculous. But nobody ever told us. I wish they were direct, right? Because we had to change schools and then come back to the old school because he didn't like the new school. There was so much of drama and trauma that we all went through as a family, and me forcing my son to like a school that he didn't like, all of that. I mean, that was my unawakened self. So I wish people were direct. It would have saved us a lot of time and energy. And this, because of that stigma, I know, and that all these rules that they have. Oh, how do we tell a parent why?
Gosh, I want to do so many trainings on, I can't tell you, all of the hard conversations got dumped on me. I am proud of the fact that I'm good at hard conversations, and like teacher, we need to learn that skill. And I also want to bring up the other piece that I see with, bringing up potential, like, hey, I'm seeing this as an issue, I don't think teachers should say, I think your child has ADHD. I mean, I don't really think that's appropriate, but say, hey, these are the patterns I'm seeing. Do you see that them at home? I also worry that people are being less honest when it's cross-cultural communication because there's these limited beliefs. I've actually talked ad nauseum with other people who are not white because this is a concern of mine. I was like, it's actually creating bias and prejudice and not getting kids the help that they need. I mean, so much so, I'm not going to say where, but I had an interview like many moons ago. I did not take the job, but they were pressing me. I have a very clear process for qualitative and quantitative data and like what would be my process and how would I communicate? And they're like, yeah, but how would you communicate with the family? I got their question. They were like referencing if it was a person of color. I was like, yeah, I'm not gonna like keep that information from a person of color. That's insane. Like that is bias. And I just didn't even know where they were trying to go with that.
I think people have their own political agenda out there. And exactly. So I wish they were more honest and true and pure.
And I think too, I mean, going back to relationship, obviously there's an authentic piece, right? I think hopefully most people can read that energy, and you need to build that relationship. I think in order to have hard conversations and for them to be heard, there has to be trust. I can't think of anything more personal than talking about a child's like growth or difficulties with a parent. Like it is the most personal conversation you can have because parenting is very personal and your child is very personal.
I'm really taken with the term and the idea of cognitive efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I love talking about this a little bit through my coaching lens because I think this is important, but also how do we kind of be aware of our own brain strengths without even getting formal testing? So for me, cognitive efficiency is you kind of have to start to identify patterns of like how you operate as a person. And so, as well as I would say, maybe personality traits. So like time management, if you do like an analysis of how you use your time, that's not just like, oh, did I get up or did I follow through? Part of it might be, man, I was supposed to do this between 11 and 12 p.m., but somebody else asked me to do something else. And I'm a people pleaser and I have to look helpful. So like there's an emotional component. And I would say going back to habit shifting, which is what I specialize in, how do we analyze how we spend our time and look at it in a way of like, these are my habits now, but in order to maintain, like, you still have to operate in your capacity. Our capacity is limited, right? And emotional things and cognitive tasks are draining from the same bucket. And I think people forget that. We all reach our capacity. So the question is like, are you aware of like these patterns of triggers that get you in a place where if it ups your anxiety, if you're dysregulated, you're no longer making good decisions anymore? And what boundaries could you have to not reach your capacity in that case? And that is related. It connects with cognitive efficiency in the sense that if you're at capacity, there's a great book called Scarcity of time, scarcity of finances, social scarcity. But it talks about how if you are making decisions from that place, it impacts your fluid reasoning, which is a lot of your decision making. And the research they did showed that you're at that moment like 13 or 14 IQ points lower. It's like really fascinating. But I really try to just leverage like, what are your strengths and how are you leaning into those? And then what are your habits where you're just going like this, right? Perpendicular instead of along with what it is that you need to do. Because if we don't think about those things in micro ways, we can't really be that efficient because we're constantly getting distracted or, getting caught up in emotional pieces. And again, it's just kind of analysis of habits in that way. Is that helpful? I feel like it's a complex question.
No, I love complex. No, and I really love just not only leaning on your strengths, but also working with weaknesses and limitations, maybe even more appropriate way to call them, because it's not a closed door, right? It's not just a wall. It's maybe a fork in the road when you have to go down like a longer path to get to where you were going, but you don't have to keep like banging up against the wall and trying to get through it. And I think we are a lot of either mental health or even cognitive health modalities focus solely on strengths and maybe kind of inadvertently teach you to ignore your weaknesses or ignore your limitations. And I think there is actually a lot of strength that can be derived from your limitations and actually understanding them and being okay with them and seeing how you can properly utilize them to set yourself up for more success.
100%. Can you really be cognitive efficient if you are not aware and accepting of your weaknesses?
Exactly.
You talked about universal design learning. So I'm going to ask you, if you had to create a school, just let's all imagine and
Just one small
fantasize.
problem we're fixing.
Yeah. How would you build a school using the universal design learning?
So universal design for learning comes from the architecture term universal design, which I think we can all maybe envision is like from a physical space, like how can everybody make their way around based on their needs? And so universal design for learning is when instruction is available, it's like multimodal. And I think a huge missing piece for me, if I was building a school, is I like a school that lives in the gray. I'm not saying I'm still a big component of like get tested, because knowing your brain, if you're neurodivergent, I think is super important to being successful. But like I was just did a chat the other day online, and no one did. It was a teacher and they didn't know what universal design for learning was. And I was like, what if just these accommodations, we made them just available? So one thing I did in schools was like, great, silencer headphones should be in every classroom. And we can talk about, hey, sometimes outside noise like bothers people, and let's play around. These are available to anyone in the room at any given time. Audiobooks should be there. Like, this doesn't, going back to universal design, people are absent from school for a billion different reasons. Teachers can't go back and teach everything. So like, even how do we set that up for someone? But even if I'm there and let's say I have slower processing speed and I really need a little bit more repetition to support my working memory, then I have some sort of access to like what happened in class online. Now I have to have the motivation and like, hey, this is something my brain needs. And it's true. I think people that work really hard that might have learning needs, like they actually have an amazing work ethic too. But how do we set that up and make these accommodations like somewhat universal and get kids to start to understand like, hey, if you see these types of characteristics, like this is what your brain needs or this is what your body needs. So that's really where I would go with that. Some of those are like physical things like the headphones or like, the squishy seats. I know these spinny stools were like worked wonders for a lot of kids that needed to move. And then I think too, it's like a training for teachers of like, we're all set in this like traditional schooling. So you feel like I have to teach like this. And I think as a teacher, it's like, where's my window of tolerance for neurodiverse characteristics? And how can I create a culture in which what Bobby needs is different from what Sarah needs? And where does that sit in my philosophy of redirection? One thing for sure, I've worked at all these private schools and built these programs, and it always really annoyed me. I was like, what is our philosophy for differentiation? Because if everybody is just choosing, nothing is consistent. And I think we know that when things aren't consistent, and I'm sitting here, well, why do I have to do it in this classroom and not in the other one? It's really hard to shift behaviors. There's no consistency. And I do think that's on the adults.
I agree. And that what you're doing needs to be amplified. Teach the teachers how to make that best use of their hour and not get stressed, right? If you don't know how to do it, because we didn't teach them, right? Even the adults. And that's why you're here to help them better manage and not create trauma to children. Because I know I've taken my whole life till now to get over that trauma of the science teacher or any other teacher or just the school system. And so I think that's so important for teachers to know, because we're creating adults, right? Children are going to be adults one day. And what kind of adults do we want to create? It's our responsibility. And so it's really important that they learn the technique the right way.
And I think the other piece, because I think there's a gray here and I want to create some refinement, is like, I don't believe that when we're trying to grow people, right, there's going to be a level of discomfort. So I don't think it's all like, oh, the adults, we're going to like manage every sensory need. We're not preparing kids for the real world if we're like fully accommodating everything, right? I see it as like neurotypical, neurodivergent, like everybody sort of needs to meet in the middle. It's not this 100% accommodation piece. And we as adults, parents, teachers, like we need to start modeling like what our needs are too. But in like obviously in a thoughtful way, like don't wait till you're just like irritated, you're like blowing up. But like I actually had a client and he was very clear about his mother needs. He was like, my mom has 2 non-negotiables. She hates being late and she hates being embarrassed in public. And as long as we don't do those things, like we're fine. I don't think I've ever heard a kid like share that with me. And I was like, that's awesome. Your mom is doing it right. And adults underestimate, we like treat kids like they're like too fragile. But if we can have like an emotionally regulated conversation and say, you know what, I've tried everything under the sun to get us out of the door on time. And I was like, I don't like starting my day with yelling. Like, I'm open to your ideas. But I said, you need to understand, like when I leave late, I get to work late. It impacts my boss. It might impact how much money I make. I mean, we don't have to pile on a crazy amount of stress, but kids don't connect those dots. Does that make sense? But do I believe in my heart they're empathetic? Heck yes. And I even shared with teachers, I was like, I've had that morning, right? Your car doesn't start or whatever the heck happened. You're rushing into work. And then being a teacher is like, you feel like you have to be a superhero. You're absorbing kids' emotions and parents' emotions. And then you're just supposed to reach all these outcomes. And I know, I didn't use it all the time, but if I was really in a place, I said, hey guys, I just want to let you know I'm having a really hard day. And it's been kind of stressful. I'd really appreciate it if you could have some patience with me today. Best behaved they ever were. Because it was like authentic and real and vulnerable. And I didn't have to get into crazy details. But again, I think modeling that you have emotions and that we all as adults also have capacity. It's not issues. It's just human, right? It's human is so important. And I don't think we're doing that enough. period.
Communication is critical, and I'm so glad you're working on that. Just getting it out of your body and sharing it saves from a lot of trauma. So just imagine if that child was not able to speak because the other person was not able to listen, because listening is a huge part of communication. And if they're not, they're going to hold it inside and they're going to grow with, and that feeling keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. And then it's going to manifest in crazy ways as an adult.
Mm-hmm. And I think that leads to lying. I think I get that question a lot. Why is my kid lying to me? I'm so supportive. And I'm like, a lot of it has to do with creating a safe environment for failure and engaging them in a collaborative process for like, what should you do? We should be tossing these questions. Again, I love coaching for this because how I help build awareness of my clients is just through really thoughtful inquiry. And if I just stopped at, I don't know, my clients would never grow. I can't tell them what the problem is. I've never been, even though I've done this work for forever, and I do consider myself a specialist, man, my clients come up with some really creative strategies that I would have never named. And most importantly, they're the only people able to identify the right problem. Like I might assume, for example, it's time management. But what I've realized with some of my clients that have ADHD is like, it's really that hard piece of balancing what's a priority. This is high interest thing at a workplace, right? This is my high interest thing. This is what I prefer to do. But these are the timelines for like my boss's expectations. And like, how do I manage when I'm given multiple tasks by different people in a workplace? I was like, wow, what a great functional life skill to think through. And then they have to think of a process that works for them. And so I do a lot where like my clients develop their own self-questioning techniques that generalize to multiple situations in their life.
Yeah, going back to something you said about, why is my kid lie to me? I think there's an interesting idea there about where this kind of like forever back and forth between parent and child truth withholding comes from, which is, as you said, children are able to process a lot more than we give them credit for. And I don't know where this societal idea that you have to lie to children all the time or withhold information or soften information in a lot of instances comes from. But all that really does is ultimately teach, because they see the blow up comes afterwards. Well, it's like, well, if you were honest in the beginning, that probably wouldn't have happened. But all they see then is like, oh, my parent lied to me. So I am now learning that you must withhold information for somebody else's feelings or for some other reason. And it creates a really vicious, unfortunate cycle. And that's kind of where that comes from, this idea that children need that because they are some sort of lesser being. And touching on something else about education and sort of like connecting it back to yourself, I think so much of what traditional education is missing is actually showing everything you're learning has something to do with your personal development. And not just, I'm not just learning history. I'm not just learning neuroscience. And it's because we're missing a lot of those pieces, like, neurodiversity should be taught in schools. Neuroscience in general should be.
Totally. Everyone should take a psychology class.
Yes, psychology. I've always said, like, philosophy should start in, like, elementary school, in my opinion. I think that would just open up a whole list of possibilities and creates a lot more emotional health in the population. But showing like all these things connect back. Like when you learn history, it's not like you're just putting information in your heads. It's like, no, this is actually like informing your view of your own personal world. Like you're getting a purview of something. There's so much that goes into it and it connects back to the neurodivergent need for why. Like just knowing that always like carried me very far. Not just interested in this subject. I'm interested in this subject because I'm kind of getting something personally out of it. I was always kind of like the nerdy kid who like read philosophy and existentialism and crap like that. So it was easy for me to like start connecting those dots. But we're just missing that piece where we're not just sitting down in a classroom. And this even extends to adults and like how we view careers and work environments. We're not just sitting down to do certain tasks or intake certain pieces of information, but we're doing it while more or less existing on a planet that carries with it a lot of connotations in various relationships and various interactions. And everything we do has some sort of purposeful matter to it, even if it doesn't seem like it. And I think the more we allow people to understand that, the more they're able to get some level of actual joy out of what they're doing. And yes, I'm even going to extend that to if you're working like a kind of a dead end job. It's like you can actually view it more as, this is my dead end job. I'm going to go now and do something that I actually do find joyful, instead of having this gray area between where there's not a lot of separation, which I think you see a lot of people fall into, where they're just in this environment, and that environment carries over to everything else because there's a certain level of indoctrination to, you are your job. When you're in school, you are a student. It's that need, as you mentioned, for labelization. We as a society tend to, I think, to better understand things, we box them in so we can pretty much bullet point mentally out what everything is. But it's not helpful when everything exists on a spectrum, not just neurodiversity. Every form of life exists on some sort of spectrum.
I agree. And I like that you brought up, I talk a lot about really identifying when I'm like decision-making frameworks. I work a lot with that because I think they should be based in values and capacity, and that's attached to motivation and consistency and being authentic. But I talk a lot about passive versus active decision-making. And so kind of going back to just connecting that to the lying piece, it is developmentally appropriate for kids to play with lying, right? That is a form of agency and a form of independence and honestly, a channel for learning consequences. Like, does it benefit me to lie or does it not benefit me to lie? So while that's appropriate, like I know kids, especially teenagers, are in this, like, I want more independence, but they're not necessarily always showing that they're ready for that level of independence. And so I actually just did this class last week on decision-making frameworks with high schoolers, because juniors and seniors are getting ready to transition into college. And I was like, how many decisions do you actually have control over right now? These little tiny decisions that we make each day, right? We make them socially. We often decide what food we eat. And then, like, where is it that you're going? Because it's when we either swoop in too much, I think, as mentors or leaders, or like put them on this robotic path, that they forget that they're even making decisions and actually how much control they have over these small decisions that actually lead to something bigger each day. Like, if I'm deciding that communication skills aren't so great, I'm having a hard time making friends, like, what are the small ways I can engage to push myself, right? Building that capacity, building that skill, so that when I'm in this place of like starting completely all over in college, it's not so terrifying. And I think it's the same too for college to career. If I just focus, all I have to do is like sort of get these grades. I have unrealistic goals. I'm going to say this out loud. Most people cannot make realistic goals. And what happens is then they're met with failure. They have a defeatist attitude. It impacts their motivation. Why even try? Circular motion. They don't examine the process for how they got there. And like for college, I think we can all agree networking is huge. It is heartbreaking to me when I work with clients and I'm like, great, who could we connect with on LinkedIn that you might know from a class or a professor or just anyone you met? And they're walking away without anyone they're comfortable reaching out to. That's huge. That's a huge disadvantage. So how do you chip away? How do you understand the complex ending of like getting a job and all those small little shifts along the way that are important and relevant to being successful or being happy? Like, let's take success out of it because it's like such a big word, like rigor. I mean, I'm a little over the word rigor too, but like, let's just talk about happiness. I mean, I also, for someone who's late diagnosed neurodivergent, they haven't gotten the right diagnosis. They don't know how it works. And they're so passive. And, then they say happiness is irrelevant. I just have to find a vocation like this. Like, I am stuck in this. If I haven't changed at this point, why would I change? That's heart-wrenching, at least to me as a coach, when I hear that, because let me tell you, digging out of that mindset hole is like, right, that's the difference between like 10 feet under versus 2 feet under. Undoing takes a lot of time.
I agree. I think so much to talk about. I'm like, what do I talk about? I love decision making. And I think we've not being taught how to make decisions, especially teenagers, because as having helicopter parents, I'm just thinking of that combination, the parent who's making all the decisions, and then the child goes off to college and then they're like, they just do things impulsively. And the child has also lost the trust with the parent, which is crucial. Anyway, in my own life, I made that shift when my son was in 11th grade, and we have a beautiful relationship. And our son calls and, we talk about stuff. And I really wish that for every parent, because you have that opportunity, that window of time in high school where you can build that trust and that relationship between parents and children, and which will continue when they leave the house.
Can you think of where Launchpads could like reach and expand to? What are your kind of maybe goals for that going into the future?
I mean, as you can imagine, my passions like accessibility is really important. I like totally understand that everyone can't pay for one-to-one coaching services, and that makes sense. And my goal is, my goal is to write a like workbook style type book with kind of case studies, but mostly like how can we use like language framing? What are questions that you can think about to sort of identify your own problems, build your self-awareness, but ultimately courses. So courses for parent coaching. How do I language frame? How am I coaching versus dictating? And college career transition courses. I'm trying to get, I think undoing, as I said, is much harder. So I do obviously offer services for that. But my goal is to work with people before they're transitioning so they don't feel so defeated. They're not at the finish line being like, okay, what now? I can't do these 15 things now to make myself be successful. So courses and group coaching, because I think community is important. I think sometimes my clients will feel like they're the only one struggling with this piece. And I think everyone's looking to connect with other people that maybe share the same thought process. And so these online live courses, because I think the questions that I develop allow for, group coaching in that way and building those skills and really digging into like, how do I make a plan for myself and think about the stepping stones and understand like what's realistic and defining those things. And then ultimately, I can't leave this out. Organizational training, neurodiversity 101. Like, how do I identify, how can I give thoughtful feedback that actually impacts change? Number one, how do I lean into hard conversations? I think every manager should have a training on that. How does nice get in the way? I could write an article on that. I could do an orientation on that. Leadership development. I think what every leader should know about neurodiverse characteristics as a whole.
Yeah. And probably end up inadvertently revealing some of their own along the way. Maybe ends up happening because there is, I think, a lot of work trauma neurodivergent people go through in regards to people above them misunderstanding how they operate or how they think, and also thinking that they're lesser because of it. It's not lesser, it's just different. Like they're still capable of the same things that another employee, a neurotypical employee, is capable of. I run some support groups, and yes, the power of groups and getting everyone having the ability to see like everybody else's answer to a question and see the other viewpoints of kind of like the same situation. But in those groups, I run into a lot of neurodivergent individuals who've been fired, just gone through like horrible job related trauma because of bosses that just would flip out, would finally like have enough, or would expect a ridiculous level of, sometimes even going so far, it feels like where if you're neurodivergent, you're expected as if you can do more complex tasks, which I've seen a couple times, which is interesting. I think it's the misunderstanding, like, oh no, if you're autistic, you must be like really good at math, that kind of thing.
Like at the savant theory is like really annoying. Yeah.
I hate that so much. I think we got really stuck on that actually after the 90s. The 90s were this conversation with a friend of mine a couple weeks ago. 90s were very obsessed with like the child savants, the child chess master kind of thing that everyone wanted their kid to be, and it put like a lot of unnecessary, inappropriate pressure on a lot of 90s kids. I've kind of slowly discovered, just like everybody kind of had a very similar experience of, if you got an A, that somehow meant you were now a child savant, and all of your parents were then bragging to everybody that you were a child savant, which then put a lot of pressure on you to keep. And like, I was just doing normal schoolwork. But
yeah. And we also don't talk about brilliance. So, right, again, we have a culture that values brilliance, and has not made that connection of how important it is to know the weaknesses. And I am here to tell you, having spent 13 years with clinical psychologists, I've worked with exceptional kids. Let's talk about what's not so pleasant about being gifted. There's some really hard, if we're really talking about, right, exceptional, there are some really hard emotional pieces to that. Immensely hard. I tell you, I've met somebody in middle school. I was like, I'm pretty sure this girl's going to cure cancer. And like the stress, there's other components there that play, I think, that you have to manage, right? There's weaknesses there. There's hardship there. There's a lot of pressure there. And how do you regulate all those things when your brain is like years above your like social level? And how do you connect with other people? We should be talking about both sides of that. It's very annoying we don't.
Yeah. We should be talking about both sides of everything, because so much we talk only about the goods. When we talk only about the good, I'm a big component of like, no, let's talk about the negative stuff and like get it out in the open. Like it's the yin and the yang, like it's on equal footing to all of the positives. And there is like a lot of undue pressure, especially with how much society puts on IQ, which we already know is broken anyway, as a measure of intelligence. But all because you're capable of something, it's automatically assumed that you are on that level emotionally as well. And that is not really the case often. There's a lot in the background. There's a lot of background noise that's going on there. And the more that's sort of ignored, the more then that noise gets louder and louder and builds up, because the individual is not allowed to express it or safely deal with it, especially because it ends up being invalidating.
And then let's just talk about potential is potential. I like to make the dating reference of like, I think we've all dated somebody for their potential. That doesn't always work out well. And I think intellectually, and I tell parents this because I believe, this shouldn't come as a shock, right? You get your kid tested there, but he's this high on his like intelligence test in math. And I'm like, yeah, he also has to do like the work. It's not like you come out of the womb and then like everything is easy. It's tied to other influential factors. If he can't explain the math and he can't show his work, right? That's also right. He's not going to develop the next like scientific mathematical theory because you do have to show your work. And it's just potential, right? Like this testing is like this idea of potential. And I think some people really misinterpret that piece. It's like I call it like, it's like a motor, but like, do you know how to use the powerful motor that's in your brain? And like, is there like a specific developmental stage? Like, it's not like if they can't use it by middle school, that it's all lost on them. I'd love to actually ask you guys, when do you think you hit your like, I don't want to say intellectual prime, but when were you like, oh man, I'm really reaching my potential now, if that makes sense. Like, for me, I don't even think it honestly happened in school.
Oh yeah. It would have been like 20s easily. It would have been way after, late 20s, if anything. In school I was, and like I said, I was pulled out at one point, but I was good. I was fine, but there wasn't anything like particularly magic about anything that I was doing. And I think you have to also find your specific niche inside the larger niche. Like you have to find the place where your brain starts to like click and go like, oh, I belong here now. Like you kind of feel it. You're able to feel it out, and whatever sort of modality that falls into, and it can come at any point in your life. Like that's why, never say like you've hit your peak, after a certain, like you can hit your peak whenever, like it does.
You can always evolve. Yeah.
You can always find it. Like that's one of the beautiful things about the human brain is like, we can kind of just keep going.
I think intelligence reaches its peak when you are aligned to your interest, right? There's always that we're not brilliant at everything. And I'm not even interested in rocket science, for instance. That's not my area of interest. But psychology has always been human behavior. And so that's why it's important for us to see where that passion is, where our interest is. And when we align with that, our intelligences just reach its peak.
Yeah, I think I would agree. The interest piece, and then just being able to put all the pieces together. And
life is a mystery.
That's great.
Let's just accept that. Right? And we're constantly evolving and growing. Yeah. Such a fun conversation with you today.
No, it's lovely. I really appreciate the conversation with you all as well.
Yes, thank you so much for wanting to come on the show and talk to us. This has been great. And I remember Launchpad kind of came on my radar a little while ago, actually. So I was kind of excited for you to come on to talk about it because I thought it was cool. So how can people reach out to Launchpad for Life and reach out to you?
Okay, so my website, launchpadforlife.org, there's a contact information form on there, as well as my email. And if you want to, I do free consults if somebody's curious about my coaching process or if an organization's interested in what trainings I could offer. So that's all available on my website. Launchpadlearningforlife@gmail.com is my contact. And then I always encourage people to connect with me on LinkedIn because sometimes schools will host free events and I'll be speaking, or I host my own free events. I'm all about just the education piece is important to me. And so I try to make that accessible. So any of those channels work for me.
Awesome. Thank you so much again for coming on. This has been really great. And of course, for Spark Launch, we can always be found at sparklaunchpodcast.com. If you enjoy this show, please rate and review us on your favorite podcasting platform. Of course, you can find us also on forms of social media, which you can find along with all the links for Launchpad for Life in the show notes below or wherever the hell you're listening to us. For us here at Spark Launch, we will see you next time.